empire practices.
Winona, you begin your book on the militarization of Native America at Fort Sill, the U.S. Army post near Lawton, Oklahoma. We broadcast from there about a year ago in that area. Why Fort Sill? What is the significance of Fort Sill for Native America?
Well, you know, that is where the Apaches themselves were incarcerated for 27 years for the crime of being Apache. There are 2 cemeteries there, and those cemeteries, one of those cemeteries is full of Apaches, including, you know, Geronimo, who did die there. But it is emblematic of Indian country's domination by military bases and the military itself. You've got over 17 reservations named after they're still called Fort something, you know. Fort Hall is, you know, one of them. Fort Yates, you know, it is pervasive, the military domination of Indian country. Most of the land takings that have occurred for the military, whether in Alaska, in Hawaii, or in what is known as the continental United States, have been takings from native land. Some of the, you know, they say that the Lakota Nation, in the Lakota Nation's traditional territory, as guaranteed under the Treaty of 1868 or the 1851 Treaty, would be the 3rd greatest nuclear power in the world. You know, those considerations indicate how pervasive historically the military has been in Native history and remains today in terms of land occupation. I must say, on the other side of that, we have the highest rate of living veterans of any community in the country. It's estimated that about 22% of our population, or 190,000 of our 190,000, there are 190,000 living veterans in Native America today. And all of those veterans, I am sure, are quite offended by the use of Geronimo's name, you know, in the assault on bin Laden and in the death of bin Laden.
Well, Winona, in your book, you go through a lot of these takings of land and what it's been used for. Obviously, the nuclear accident following the tsunami in Japan has been in the news a lot lately. But you talk about the origins of the United States' own nuclear power, the mining of uranium, the development of Los Alamos Laboratory. Could you talk about that and its connection to Indian country?
Yeah, you know, Native people, about 2/3 of the uranium in the United States is on indigenous lands. On a worldwide scale, about 70% of the uranium is either in Aboriginal lands in Australia or up in the subarctic of Canada, where Native people are still fighting uranium mining. And now with both nuclearization and the potential reboot of a nuclear industry, they're trying to open uranium mines on the sacred Grand Canyon. You know, we have been from the beginning heavily impacted by radiation exposure from the U.S. military. You know, continuing on to nuclear testing, whether in the Pacific or whether the 1,100 nuclear weapons that were detonated over Western Shoshone territory. You know, our peoples have been heavily, you know, impacted by radiation, let alone nerve gas testing. You've got nerve gas dumps at Umatilla. You've got a nerve gas dump at the Skull Valley Goshute Reservation. You have, you know, weapons bases, and the military is the largest polluter in the world. And a lot of that pollution in what is known as the United States, or some of us would refer to as occupied Indian country, is in fact all, you know, heavily impacting Indian people or indigenous communities still.
You also talk about the radiation experimentation in Alaska in the 1960s in your book. I don't think very few people have heard of that. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, you know, I was an undergraduate at Harvard, and I remember I researched all this really bizarre data, but there was this project at Point Hope where the military wanted to look at the radiation lichen caribou man cycle of bioaccumulation of radiation. And so they went into the Arctic. You know, there's widespread testing on Native people because we're isolated populations. We're basically, you know, most of us in that era were genetically pretty similar. It was a good test population, and there was no accountability. You know, testing has occurred, you know, widespread. But in that, they wanted to test, so the village of Point Hope was basically irradiated. Didn't tell the people. Documents were declassified in the 1990s. And all that time, this community bore a burden of nuclear exposure that came from the Nevada test site, you know, and in testing those communities. You know, Alaska itself is full of nuclear and toxic waste dumps from the military, over 700 separate, including, you know, perhaps one of the least known, but I did talk about it in this book, The Militarization of Indian Country, VX Lake, where they happened to forget about some nerve gas canisters, a whole bunch of them, and they put them out in the middle of the lake, and they sank to the bottom. And then they remembered a few years later, and then they had to drain the darn lake to go get all these, you know, all the nerve gas, VX, out of the bottom of the lake. And, you know, they renamed it Blueberry Lake, but it's still known as VX Lake to anybody who's up there. And, you know, the unaccountability of the military, above reproach, you know, having such a huge impact on a worldwide scale, having such a huge take at the federal trough, the federal budget, and in indigenous communities, an absolutely huge impact in terms of the environmental consequences of militarization.
We're talking to Winona LaDuke, Native American activist, writer. Her latest book is called The Militarization of Indian Country. Winona, talk about the history of Native participation in and opposition to war, but begin with your dad, with your father.
Yeah, I wrote this book out of a debt, you know, really to my father. My father was a Korean War resistor, and he spent 11 months in prison for refusing to fight a war that he did not believe was his. There is a long history of Native people, whether the Zunis, whether the Hopis, whether the Iroquois, whether the Ojibways, who said, you know, that's really not our war. We're staying here. The United States, you know, people... you know, one of the reasons that it is said that Native people received citizenship in 1924 was so that they could be drafted, and they have been extensively drafted, you know, for a whole variety of social, political, historic, cultural, and economic reasons. Native people have the highest rate of enlistment in this country, you know, from historic to present. You know, in some places, you know, in our Indian communities, you know, you have very dire economic situations, and the military recruiters are very aggressive. And young people do not have a lot of choices. I mean, you know, I had a young man from my community say, you know, Auntie, I joined the military. I said, why did you join the military? He says, because I was either going to jail or going to the military. You know, and I have heard that story more than once in Indian country. So, you know, having said that, you have a history of warrior societies, of people who are proud, who have defended our land. You know, 500 years is a long time to defend your territory. And, you know, we're still here. And within that, you know, our warrior societies continue, you know, whether it is at Oka, whether it was at Wounded Knee, whether it is on the front lines of the tar sands in Alberta, Canada, or whether it is in the Grand Canyon defending our territory. At the same time, you have a number, you know, a large rate of enlistment. And so, you know, you have Native veterans who are in our community highly regarded for who they are as courageous individuals, you know, and a very significant part of our communities. At the same time, there is no program to reintegrate these individuals into our society. A lot of, you know, the highest rate of homelessness is in the veterans in this country. And, you know, many other issues of PTSD and such exist widespread in our communities because of our isolation and our high rates of enlistment and our high rates of veterans.
Winona LaDuke, you also talk, when talking about Fort Sill, about the Comanche people asking for Fort Sill not to destroy Medicine Bluff. Can you talk about the sacred places in the United States, starting with Fort Sill? Where are they threatened, and how do you preserve these lands?
Well, you know, the military you know, the U.S. government's the largest landowner. The United States, you know, Native people are large landowners, but the military has a huge chunk of our territories. And in those, there are a number of places that are our sacred sites. You know, perhaps the best examples are really in Hawaii, where, you know, the military took the island of Ho'olave, an entire island, to turn it into a bombing range for 40 years. that is my first politicization, I would say, as to the impact of the military, in indigenous communities. Took a whole island, and then, eventually the island is now returned. The aquifer is cracked from bombing, and it is it's unconscionable, the practice. Today, Hawaii, you see the continuation of the expansion of military holdings there. Pohakaloa is an expansion for the Striker that they're looking at on the big island of Hawaii to take another 79,000 acres of land. There's only so much land on an island full of sacred sites, full of historic sites that Hawaiians and Native Hawaiians and all people have a right to visit, but now is becoming a part of a military base. And increasing land takings, particularly in Hawaii, is one of the worst cases.
And Winona, as we mentioned earlier, you were a vice presidential candidate twice on the ticket, an independent ticket with Ralph Nader. And as you see now in these years of the last few years of the Obama administration, do you see any significant change in the way that the Native American nations across the country have been treated under the Obama administration?
I would say that things are better. I would say we've got a few egregious problems still. You have, for instance, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. As you likely know, there were 4 holdout countries as of 2007 that did not sign on. U.S. and Canada are the only 2 countries that have yet to sign on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Obama administration made some lip service to it, posturing. I was thinking maybe we're in like some kind of yoga position on it. I don't know what posture he's in, but we'd like to see that, carried out. As well, apology. These are in many ways symbolic gestures. There was an apology to Native peoples that was issued, but no one heard it. So it's kind of like saying, I'm sorry to a wall. Probably should have a little formal apology. But then there is the reality of that things in Indian country are not getting better. You can't keep putting money in the federal budget for the military and robbing everything else so that, people on my reservation and other reservations don't have housing, don't have education money, don't have health service, don't have, basic rights. And the only way, in the Native community really to get economically ahead in many cases is to become a military contractor. I don't know if you noticed in the book that it turns out that Blackwater is a Native American contractor. Now, I didn't know that, and I really hadn't thought of them as a Native American contractor, but with the Chiniga Native Corporation, they've got about $1.9 billion in federal contracts that they received, most of those as a sole source, non-bid contractor because they went under the shell of an Alaska Native corporation, the Chiniga Corporation. And so, Native communities are becoming military contractors because that's where the money is. So the irony of the whole history of colonization, military colonization, valiant patriots like Geronimo, fighting against, the U.S. taking of our lands, the destruction of our peoples, to now a situation where the largest private army in the world is a Native American contractor, and the fact that they so egregiously abuse the name of Geronimo, and in widespread cases, refer to Indian country as the territory that is to be taken by the U.S. military. It is time to revisit this history.